My name is William Lee. I'm a Senior Research Fellow within the YQSR. I'd like to introduce our speaker, someone that I've had the pleasure of working with for the last couple of years. Vicki LeBlanc is Chair and Professor of the Department of Innovation in Medical Education at the University of Ottawa. She has over 20 years experience leading research into A, the effects of emotions and stress on the performance of health professionals and frontline workers, and B, optimizing the use of simulation in health professions education. She's authored over 100 peer-reviewed publications and regularly presents her work nationally and internationally. She's held several national level leadership roles related to scholarship, accreditation, and educator development in simulation-based education. So the title of Vicki's presentation, Taking the Weather into Account, the Relationship Between Emotions and Performance. I think I asked Vicki, I gave her the challenge of bringing together simulation and simulation education and emotions and patient safety. So no small challenge, I guess. But I'd like to not delay any further and pass on to Vicki.
Thank you, Will, and thank you everybody for joining what is this morning for me, but afternoon for you. Let me just share my slides. Will, is that coming across okay?
That's great, yeah.
Okay, so we'll get started. And I apologize, but let's hope that I'm not going to have a coughing fit while I'm giving this presentation. I'm just getting over a cold. It's respiratory season for us. So what I want to talk to you about is the study of the role of emotions in performance. And so I'm going to start with a question of what should we do when it rains? In Canada, we don't probably have as much rain as you do in the UK, but there's a general kind of consensus that rain is something that's generally viewed on as being a bit more negatively. But its value is going to depend, right? So for example, if I've decided to take my bike into work and I mistimed the speed that the squall was coming in, the rain in this case, then the wind is going to be a bad thing because I'm going to have to take shelter despite having my helmet and my rain poncho. So the context is going to be bad. However, if the rain comes and when we haven't had rain for a while in my rooftop garden, it saves me from having to water my garden, which always involves fighting with this little cat who's trying to get out on my deck, I'm going to welcome that rain. So the rain is not necessarily good or bad. It's going to depend on the context in which it comes. And on the flip side, if I ask you, things that we generally consider good within our societies, which are beautiful, hot, sunny days in the summer, are there reasons that we should worry about it? And generally, we tend to think these are the days that we want and these are the days that we welcome. But there's cases where these days are actually worrisome. And one of them, which always kind of freaks me out a little bit as somebody who has a bit of wanderlust and likes to travel. And in Canada, we tend to worry about getting on planes in winter and rainy seasons, but it's actually pretty risky to take planes in hot weather because the air is going to become thinner and it's going to require longer takeoffs. And the other thing too is that's also going to create shifts that the air is going to rise. So in addition to the air being thinner, it's going to create actually wind shears or sudden changes in wind direction or speed. So that means that landing and takeoff can actually be a lot more turbulent. And so it presents a lot more challenges. So for those of us who like to travel to nice, warm, balmy places, it kind of puts a little bit of a damper on that because we think, it's a little bit riskier to get on that plane. The other thing that is interesting is that there's associations between weather and trauma season. And that there's a lot of research that is looked at to show that you actually have increases in trauma in the times of the year when you have nicer weather, and even when you control things for like the number of people that are traveling and a lot of other factors. There's something about nice weather that leads to more trauma. Which for us is interesting in Canada because you would always think that trauma season would be around Christmas. Our roads get icy, they get snow on them, everybody's traveling to visit family. but it's really summer when there's going to be some more risk. And when I run this by my emergency medicine physicians, they say yes, because that's the season of watch this. People are a little bit more risk tolerant or willing to take on risk, and their guard goes down, and they do things that can get them into a little bit more trouble. And so the question you might be asking yourself is, okay, well, you've asked us to come and, we've come here to talk about emotions and to talk about its impact on patient safety. Why are we talking about the weather? Because to me, the weather is a really good metaphor for how I think about emotions. So the weather, when we think about it, is the weather is always there. It's always omnipresent. There's always one weather pattern or another. Whether or not that given weather pattern is good or bad is going to depend on the context, as the examples I've just given you about the rain and sunny days. But if we want to understand mechanisms of daily life, we have to understand what are the antecedents of weather patterns, what are the mechanisms of weather patterns, and then how do things work differently under different weather conditions? Aerodynamics, so how do planes fly in different weather conditions? For those of us that aspire to have a green thumb, horticulture, how do you grow different types of plants or vegetables in different contexts and different weather patterns? But also infrastructures. How do you need to build infrastructure differently depending on what the weather patterns are going to be? And so the weather is not something that we can sort of push aside if we're trying to understand a lot of these things. And so my perspective and what I'm hoping to convince you of is that we can just substitute affect for weather, is that if we want to understand the mechanisms of daily life, we have to understand what are the antecedents to different affective patterns, what triggers anger, what triggers anxiety, what triggers joy. How do these different affective patterns work? What is their mechanisms? And then how do things like what we perceive, how we view it, ambiguity, how do we solve problems, how do we make decisions, how do we interact with each other? If we really want to understand these phenomenons, and these are all phenomenon that can underpin both health professions learning, but also the practice of health professions, then understanding how they function when we're angry, when we're sad, when we're anxious is going to be critical to having a full picture. And so what I'm hoping, before I go into that, so when I'm talking about affect, what is my definition? What are we talking about? So affects are these, the theories are that these are appraisal-based signals as to whether a situation is going to be beneficial or detrimental for our goals. So I have a goal that might be, I want to get to the office this morning in time to be ready for this presentation. And there's going to be a number of things that are happening that may be beneficial or detrimental. And so the system will sort of do this almost automatic subconscious assessment of good, bad, good, or not. And then that, depending on the appraisal that we do, how much control we will have an affective reaction. And those affective reactions will have a number of components. So there'll be the subjective, I feel happy, I feel anxious. There'll be physiological reactions. So the sympathetic nervous system, in the case of stress, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system will kick in. There's also some cognitive perspectives that the way we process information is going to change. And then there's also some behavioral components, right? There's emotions like anger that make us get a little bit bigger, make us lean in, that are approach. But then there's things like shame that can be avoided so that the body will actually shrink into itself. And in turn, all of these different processes will then shape our thoughts, our motivations, our actions, and our social interactions. And when we're talking about affective states, affect is generally the overarching term that can include emotions and moods. And emotions are more environmental states and cognitive appraisals that are accompanied by that are accompanied with physiological processes and facial expressions. And so emotions are more short-term reactions to something, right? I'm angry because people don't drive well in the snow in Canada, even though we get snow every year, and I'm going to run being late, right? So I'm blaming this on other people. It's a very short reaction to something. A mood are more long-term, lower intensity, and they're generally less focused on something. So I woke up generally happy. I'm feeling generally sad today. And so these are the differences in how we tend to think about them. And then these, especially when we think about emotions, can be integral. So they're associated with a particular target and they're relevant to the judgment at hand. So having to make a decision about possible treatment options for a patient is causing me some anxiety. That would be an integral affective reaction. But we often have to function sometimes in incidental. So I may have just, I told you I love the snow. There's a beautiful snow. I walked in from this beautiful snowy day. That makes me happy. But then I have to make subsequent decisions and I have to do subsequent processes. So I'm still in that affective state, but it's incidental to the decisions that I need to make. And so what I want to do, there we go. So what I want to do today, having done those definitions and sort of shared with you the perspective that I have, is try to present some arguments of why I feel that it matters that we pay attention to this if we're thinking about either how we train health professionals or how we approach patient care or patient safety. And to give you some examples of what I think are fairly powerful examples of how the emotions can affect it. And so let's start. So I think I don't need to convince you that healthcare is emotional, right? There's some pretty high stakes decisions that need to be made, often in situations of uncertainty, often having to navigate various different components. And so there can be very strong negative emotions, right? Things can make people anxious, things can be heartbreaking, things can be maddening, but there can also be moments of unexpected joy and there can be moments of relief. And I think we all recognize that there's these strong emotions in healthcare, but I think we all have a bit of a discomfort with what is the role that these emotions play in healthcare. And when I work a lot with educators and I see the gamut of it, that one end, there'll be the idea that if we want to create psychologically safe learning environments for our learners, we can't present too many strong, different, like challenging situations because these are vulnerable learners and we're afraid of breaking the already cracked egg. On the other side, there'll be the perspective of if we don't throw challenges at people to make them stronger, then how are they going to be able to face what's going to be going forward, right? So this idea of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And there's people that live at the extreme, but most people will sometimes be in the middle and say, well, we know that emotions are there, and we know that sometimes emotions are a bit uncomfortable, and we know that they probably have an effect, but we're not really sure what is that effect. And so a lot of people are, from my experience, are sitting in that middle. And yet, if we look at the messages that our environments give us, there's generally this implicit message that things like joy, compassion, calmness are, generally very positive messages that we have, that these are pretty good emotions to have. But if you look at the left side, it's generally we have these tacit ideas that having anger, having sadness, having anxiety, being frazzled are generally viewed as being bad things. And so the messages that we see a lot in our field is that joy and compassion are viewed as being good, both for us, but also for the patients, because they both increase well-being and they're thought to increase the ability to function. And when we talk about emotional regulation, we're often talking about the uncomfortable emotions, so anger, anxiety, frustration, that are viewed as being detrimental and be downregulated and avoided. And my concern with this sort of dichotomous view is I feel that it's a little bit, sometimes a little bit simplistic. That what we're doing is that sometimes we're targeting the wrong problem, right? The problem we seem to be targeting is going after the emotions that feel uncomfortable. And it's missing some important realities that sometimes these emotions might be beneficial. Sometimes the emotions that we think are good might be detrimental. And that a lot of the messages that we have, which is really about pushing for people to go towards wellness and kind of promoting the idea of compassion and joy, while it itself not a bad thing, but if it becomes our ultimate goal, it's an almost impossible goal to accomplish. And so at best, it's going to be ineffective, and at worst, it's going to be potentially damaging. But the thing that for me, where I get really interested in is that unless we fully understand the role that emotions play with different components that are involved in patient care, we're going to have an incomplete understanding of things like How do our attention processes function? How do we retain memory? How are we able to recall? How is it that we approach learning or problem solving, the decisions making, but then also looking at things like interpersonal teamwork and professionalism? And so, what I want to talk to you about today a little bit is a lot of the work that my team and I have done, which is looking at the effects of stress and anxiety. What do we know about it? How does it affect it? Then I want to talk about a little bit broader in terms of looking at some of the other emotions. And then I want to finish with implications for training and also implications for practice. So let's start with the stress and anxiety. Um, so the perspective that I take in looking at this work is I come at it from affective neurosciences, which is very interested in looking at what are the triggers, what are the mechanisms that create an emotion? How do those emotions then influence the way that the brain and the nervous system functions? And in terms, how does that affect thought and consciousness? And it used to be this concept that emotions and cognitions were treated in different parts of the brain. So the idea was that the limbic system, so the hippocampus, the amygdala, was the seat of the emotions. This was our primitive brain. This was something that kind of reacted without a lot of oversight and a lot of thought. And the ideas were then that are more recent parts of the brain that have developed, the prefrontal cortex was where the seat of things like strategic planning, metacognition, the cold cognition that really separated us from our more animal kind of emotional perspectives. And so priority has always been given to a lot of the idea of cold reasoning, of cold decision making. But the research is actually starting to show that that's not as separate as we thought it was. The limbic system is actually heavily involved in cognitive processes like attention and memory. We also know that the prefrontal brain is also involved in emotional processing to the part that if there are lesions to certain parts of the brain, people are not able to make adaptive decisions in an affective situation. The other thing we know is that there's more connections from the limbic system to the prefrontal brain than there is in the other direction. So, all of that to say that the human brain has actually evolved such that we prioritize emotional information, we prioritize emotional stimuli because these are usually situations that actually have repercussions for our physical, social, or psychological survival. And so, what emotions do is they're signals to the system that tell us, hey, pay attention. There's something happening here that needs your attention. And they're then going to guide ongoing processes, cognitive processes to direct attention, memory, and judgment towards addressing whatever triggered that emotion. And so in psychology, we call this mood congruent processing, that we selectively attend to and recall information that's congruent with our emotions. And so I like these two trees because they represent well that the world that I live in when I'm sad, because of what I pay attention to, because of how I interpret ambiguity, because of how I remember information, is essentially a different world that I live in than when I'm happy. And so this is where the idea that emotions are essentially the weather within which our cognitive processes occur. And because we're always in one emotional state or another, it's to me, it's almost impossible to understand cognitive processes without understanding how they function in the different emotional weather patterns. And so let me give you some examples from the stress world. I think a lot of us have this belief that we remember a lot more from stressful events. If we think about situations from our past, our childhood that have stayed with us, they're usually situations that had some pretty strong emotional components to it. And stress is one of the affective states that has been studied the most because it's one of the ones that's actually more easily to reliably instill in people. I've unfortunately become very good at knowing exactly how to stress participants. And so there's this review that came out about 8 years ago that I really like because they put together all of the different literature and looked to see what is the relation between stress and the different stages of memory. So there's the encoding. You encounter something new and it's actually when it enters into the memory system. Then there's the consolidation process, where you have temporary memory traces are turned into long-term storage. Retrieval is you haven't thought about something, you have to retrieve information that you've learned previously. And then the final step is most of us by this point in our lives have a lot of accumulated knowledge and information, but we still are learning new things. So sometimes we have to update what that knowledge is. And the research shows that if you encounter stress, immediately before or immediately after encoding some new information, you're going to remember more information. If you encounter stress before you have to retrieve information or before you have to update it, you're going to have less, your ability to do that is going to be decreased. And then here at the bottom left is if you encounter stress a long time before encoding, you're going to remember less of the information you're encoding. But what's interesting here is that immediately and long term is defined by psychology terms. And for us, that means minutes. So essentially, if you encounter stress at the moment that you're encoding new information, you're going to retain more. If you encounter stress a long time before, which can be as short as 5 or 10 minutes before, you're not going to be able to encode as much of it. So there is some truth to the idea that stress can enhance what it is that we remember. It's very time dependent. And so we're going to have greater memory around the time for stressful encounters for what has triggered that emotion. But we're going to have impaired memory for information that's long after that stressful event, right? So this idea that we remember more from emotionally provocative situation has some truth to it. But where it gets interesting is that there's an important caveat that needs to be made between quantity and quality, because there's some important biases in what we're going to remember. And one of the biases that we have is that emotions can actually be associated with incorrect reconstructions of past events based on what our expectations were. And so a very powerful example is September 11th, 2001, when the planes flew into the Twin Towers and into the Pentagon. We're nearly 23 years later, but every time I ask people where they were, do they remember exactly where they were when they hear about it? Pretty consistently, I will get 95% of the room. I gave this talk in Denmark last week, and I had 90% of the room that remembered exactly where they were. They could describe hearing about it, they can remember what they witnessed. And if you ask how strong the memories were, people are still, this is still a very marking event from our lives. And the research supported that. So studies that were done 2 years later and 6 years later, and even now when I'm talking with individuals about this, nearly all of us are going to remember exactly where we were the moment that we heard about the September 11th attacks. But here's where it gets interesting. In these studies, what they found is that nearly 3/4 reported incorrectly that they saw on television the first plane striking the towers. There were, at the time that the media was coming out, there were no recordings that were shown of the first plane striking the towers. It turns out that there is one recording that exists, and it was actually people were doing a documentary about workers in New York that they saw the plane, but that video only came out quite a period of time after. But people were quite confident that they'd seen on television the first plane striking the towers. And what that showed us is that we don't have snapshot memories of things that have happened. We'll remember some pieces, but there's going to be a lot of holes in our memory. And when we remember from emotional events, we're going to be more dependent on what we know or what we would expect to happen in that situation. And so we were curious to say, well, would that work in situations that are not as emotionally impactful? And so we did a study with paramedics that we had paramedics working through using a simulated ambulance. We had paramedics working through patient care scenarios. And one of those scenarios was a low stress one, which are the blue bars. And one of them, we induced some stressors that were not going to change the management or the information that was presented to them, but was set to kind of trigger a stress response in them. And we looked at how they performed in the scenario, but we also asked them to complete an accident call report in which they document every piece of information that was made known to them, any treatment that was done, the hemodynamic values. And then we compared what they put in these accident call report with what had actually happened in the scenario. And then we coded errors for omission errors. Did they fail to put down information? And then we looked at commission errors. Did they put down information that had actually not been present in the scenario? And what we found is that between the high stress and low stress, there was no differences in omission errors. They weren't more likely to forget if they were in the stress condition. Where it got interesting is that they were more likely to have false memories of the scenario in the high stress condition. So similar to the September 11th example that I've given you is that after we've been in a stressful situation, we're more likely to falsely remember things from that situation that would have aligned with that generally would have aligned with what our expectation would be or what our schema would be. And so this is just an example to show that emotional events are vivid, but our memories of them are not always accurate. And so if I think from a perspective, if we think about it from perspective of educators, then we think, okay, what are our learners going to take away from these situations? If they're going through emotional situations, are they going to take away the information that as educators we want them to take away? If I think about it from a patient safety component is if we are then taking from these emotional situations, we're asking people to do patient documentation. Can we trust the accuracy of this patient documentation if the healthcare team was highly stressed during that scenario, or is there likely going to be some errors that are induced in there? And so these are some questions that this research provokes. Without giving other examples, we have looked at other cases of what is the effect of stress, and we found in general that we generally see disrupted performance, both on global aspect of performance, but also on following checklists, adherence to protocols, the commission errors that I just told you about. We see working memory impairments, which is if we ask paramedics to do drug calculations in their heads as they're treating a patient, that ability is actually decreased when they're in a stressful situation. And we also see subtle alterations in reasoning, right? We're more likely to do premature closure. So stopping prematurely on a diagnostic without fully exhausting what the alternatives could be. We see a shift towards encapsulation, so thinking in gestalt general levels rather than individual levels. And we see that judgments or risk are going to be increased when people are stressed. We also, Will and I are just wrapping up a study where we found that with learners, when learners are having, when learners that are more stressed in simulated situations where they have to do an A to E assessment on an acutely ill or deteriorating patient and then have to hand over to a senior clinician, we see more errors and more inefficiencies when they're doing that clinical handover. So they're reporting incorrect information, or they have not gathered the right information and then have to spend more time going to collect that. The other thing that we found is because we could actually see the moments when these learners were stressed, and we compared this with when the errors were happening, we found that errors are 1.5 times more likely to happen during high stress scenarios, high stress moments, than they are doing low stress or moderate stress. So a lot of this research does suggest that stress and anxiety responses can have negative effects on both learning and performance. The question that I ask myself for this is, but are there situations where a little bit of pressure, a little bit of tension, what we call eustress, might actually be beneficial? And how do we understand that? And how do we take a look at that? But the thing that I want to switch about now is think a little bit differently, because when I started doing this work, because I was very specifically interested in stress, it started being interpreted as emotions were bad, and negative emotions, right? Anxiety, anger, these were bad, and we needed to eliminate them. And so it got me very interested in saying, well, what is the impact of other emotions? And so some of the research that looks at is, for example, I gave you the example of how emotional events are going to shape memory. So those biases that I told you about that we have from anxiety provoking situations, we have that filling in of the gaps, right? The more false memories from situations where we've been very happy, from situations where we've had a lot of anger, in addition to anxiety and stress. Interestingly, sadness moments that make us sad, we don't have as many of those false memories. So there's a little bit of research that's starting to get us to understand what are the emotions that lead us to have more of false memories, and what are the ones that seem a bit more impervious to it, and why is that? Um, the other thing that emotions also do is they actually influence our perception and our willingness to take risks. And so there's a very interesting, almost kind of forgotten study that was done by Johnson and Tversky, who did a lot of work on reasoning and making decisions. And what they looked at is they asked individuals to estimate the frequency of various risks. So fatal risk, right, of people being in a fire, of leukemia, war, and terrorism. Non-fatal risk. How they decided that tornadoes and floods were non-fatal versus fire, I'm not sure, but that was their definition. And that also looking at the likelihood of life problems, so having bankruptcy, depression, unemployment. And they looked to see what emotional state individuals were in. And what they found is that individuals who were in a positive affective state were more likely to have lower estimates of probability, right? They thought that these situations were less likely to happen when they're in a positive emotional state. When they're in a negative emotional state, they're more likely to think that these events are more likely to happen. But interestingly, in health, sorry, I'm jumping ahead, but there's a little bit of work that's been looking at that, and it seems to suggest that there's some affective states that are linked with perceptions of greater risk. So when when we have fear, when we are sad, when we experience disgust, individuals are more likely to think that the world is a risky place. When individuals are having positive emotions, when they're feeling anger and when they're feeling boredom, they're more likely to decrease the likelihood of having risk, right? So the world is more or less risky depending on the emotional state that we're in. Interestingly, though, this hasn't been looked at a lot in clinical decision making. So, a lot of the focus when we look at the work on clinical decision making tends to focus more on the emotional burden of emotions, of decision making. Is that having to make decisions can create stress, it can create strong emotional reactions in individuals. But when we look at our models of clinical reasoning, the majority of them won't actually address affective states. Or if they do, they tend to treat affective states sort of globally as a source of error. Strong emotions lead us astray. And these emotions are often emotions like anger, or anxiety, or stress. Um, there's been a few studies that have looked to see whether or not clinical reasoning changes when decisions have to be made around difficult or emotionally evocative patients. So it's vignettes of patients that are considered difficult. And they do find that there's greater diagnostic error, a decreased recall of clinical information. During a handover, there's going to be an omission of critical information, and there's decreased optimism about the prognosis. The problem with some of these studies is that because they actually didn't measure the emotional state of the people making decisions, they just created vignettes of emotionally evocative. It's not, we can't know whether or not it's caused by the affective, the emotional state of the healthcare workers, or whether or not it's linked to patient characteristics, right? Stereotypes or likability of the patient, which we know can affect decision making. So we wanted to take a look at this in a study. And it was a small sort of initial study that we had 19 anesthesia residents come to do a simulated scenario. And we measured their incidental affect. So they just filled out a scale ahead of time that just tested a number of positive or negative emotions and how strongly they were feeling them. Then we gave them two patient cases. So one where there was an abstract social connection. So we just had them fill out a paper vignette. The other one was an explicit social connection. So they met with a simulated patient. They did a pre-op assessment, quick one with the patient, and then they received information on the paper. And they had to decide, this was a preoperative assessment, they had to decide whether or not to proceed with a surgical procedure with patients that presented certain risks and that there was likely going to be an absence of the resources that they needed to treat them. So, would they proceed with a potentially risky surgery without the resources that they might need. And we just asked them to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, will you proceed with this surgery? And then we looked to see what was the relationship between their likelihood of proceeding and their affective state. And what we found is there wasn't a big relationship with intensity of negative affect, either in the abstract social connection or the explicit social connection. Very weak correlations, but we also found that our participants didn't really report negative affect. For some reason, these anesthesias were kind of in a good mood. They weren't feeling very negative, which we don't always see when they come to simulation. So we did something right there. But they were most likely in a mildly positive affect is where the range that they were. And what we found is, again, no relationship when there was an abstract social connection. But when there was an explicit social connection, when it was explicit that they had met the person, the decision they were making about the person was more explicit for them, we actually found a pretty strong correlation that the stronger the positive affect, the more likely they were to proceed with a potentially risky surgery. And their positive affect explain almost a quarter of the variance, which in psychology type literature is actually a pretty strong correlation. So the happier they were, the more likely they were to proceed with a potentially risky situation. And so what are the mechanisms that underlie that? And part of that is that we have a preferential detection of information that's going to be concurrent with our affective state. So if individuals are tending to feel more happiness, more joy, they're more likely to notice the positive things in their environment and less likely to notice the negative things. They're also going to change how they interpret any kind of ambiguity so that the happier we are, the less we're going to think that something that's ambiguous is going to be threatening. Whereas if we're anxious, the slightest little thing could potentially be a very bad thing. So it changes these aspects. But the other thing is that positive affects are actually very socially motivating emotions, is that when we have a positive affect, it actually motivates us towards increasing social connections. Um, Positive emotions create this sort of broaden and build, is that we build resources, we build connections as a bit of a store to be able to deal with subsequent later things. And so it's possible that these optimistic risk assessments that are observed are going to be amplified in interpersonal context. And so these are just some early studies that are telling us that it's not only stress that can affect how it is that we approach the world, but that we can actually see measurable differences in clinical decision making based on the emotional state of participants. Um, the question that says is then, who do we want to have? So for me as a patient, who do I want to have making decisions about my care, right? Do I want the clinician who's a bit anxiously risk averse or disgustedly cautious? Or do I want the angry risk taker, or do I want the happy optimist? And I would sit there and say, well, it would probably depend on the context that I'm in. In some cases, we might want to have more risk averse and being cautious. In other cases, we might actually want somebody who's more optimistic and risk taking. And so this is just one example to show that emotions can actually have an impact on the processes that are involved in care. And the more we study emotions, the more that we're trying to be able to predict the effect that they have on cognitive skills. So positive emotions are linked with more problem solving abilities and transferring to information to new situations. But they also come with the fact that when we're happy, we spend less time trying to solve a problem. So I might be better at being able to creatively find solutions, but I'm less motivated because positive emotions tell me everything's good, let your guard down. So I'm also going to be increasingly distractible, and I'm going to have a greater willingness to take on risk. Um, as um, I've shown you examples of what anxiety does as well. But the other thing that we find anxiety is we're going to see greater perseverance with maladaptive problem solving strategies. We're more likely going to persevere and fixate on a strategy that's not working when we're anxious. But in people who tend to be generally low anxious trait, stress can actually increase motivation. And I'm guilty of that. I am never so good at writing grants or getting papers done than when I think I might just not make the deadline, right? So for me, some level of anxiety, because I tend to not be a stressed individual, actually can be increased motivation. So I might not be as creative at solving the problems, but I'm more willing to keep trying at it. And then you have other emotions like sadness, which sadness tells us something bad has happened. I'm not sure what the cause is. I'm not sure who's responsible, and I'm not sure how much control I have. And so it pushes us into a way of thinking of deeply trying to understand the problem to make sure that we're never in that situation again. And so it means that we're going to have deeper reasoning. We're going to have more accurate memories. So we have fewer false memories from sad events. Our judgments are going to be less biased, and we actually have more motivation to solve problems. And so I often joke, have jokingly say that if my clinician is a little bit sad, that might not have a bad outcome for me. Not that I'm Machiavellian and I want my clinicians to be sad all the time, but sadness, although a very unpleasant emotion to have, cognitively has fewer of the biases that we see in other emotions. And so this raises a lot of questions that I'm interested in, and hopefully I've convinced you to think about is, maybe we need to have a better understanding of the different impacts of different emotions to be able to understand how do they impact the different aspects of care. In the meantime, though, although hopefully I've convinced people that want to do more research in this area, how do we approach this from a training perspective? And so I think that the key idea that I would want to say is that emotions are not good or bad; they just are. Um, and sometimes these emotions are going to be conducive to the goals, and sometimes they're not. And I think it's important for us to know that even though something is unpleasant and uncomfortable, it's not necessarily maladaptive for either the situation for our cognitive skills. And although there's a lot of complexity to it, the solution is not going to be to say, well, we need to push emotions aside, we need to suppress them or avoid them, because emotions are so powerful. They're so ingrained in the way that we navigate the world that even if we try to suppress them, they're still going to be active. And they act a little bit like a pressure cooker. And we know that there's increasing research that shows that people who have avoidant or suppression emotion regulation strategies are more likely to have mental health and physical health outcomes. So there's a link with cardiovascular incidents. There's a link with depression, anxiety, and post traumatic stress. So the solution is not to say we just need to put a clamp down on these emotions, but the idea is that we need to be thinking about how we can teach people to become more aware of their emotional situation, what that emotion means, and how you can regulate them in adaptive ways. And so this is where it comes into a lot of the simulation is that, if we think about training, a lot of what we think about when we do training is skill retention, skill acquisition, and oftentimes we practice under most of the time predictable and uniform conditions. But we can supplement that in this case with stress training, which is it's about recognizing somebody's stress response, learning what is an adaptive regulation strategy, and you pre-expose them to that. With what they do is they actually apply the special skills training. And it's not sort of an as a side that you do of like, okay, we're going to teach them how to manage an ACLS case and we're going to throw in some stressors and they're going to learn. The stress training actually has to become an explicit focus. And it's about teaching adaptive techniques such as how do we reframe? So how do we change negative thoughts into more task-oriented things like acceptance, things like team co-regulation? How do team members recognize emotions in others and use adaptive ways to do interpersonal regulation? How do we learn physiological control? So how do you get the whole physiological system to down-regulate a bit? Things as simple as breathing techniques that can be done with or without biofeedback, and also things we can do preemptively of mental practice and rehearsal of how do we visualize a procedure, a task, or a scenario, and the different possible outcomes that there could be with it, so that we can be prepared for the unexpected when it's going to come in. So there's a lot of techniques that we could do where we could use things like simulation to explicitly get people to learn what their emotional reaction is, what their stress reaction is, and teach them adaptive regulation strategies that to say it's not that you're going to get rid of stress, it's that you're going to better be able to recognize, okay, I'm stressed right now. This is the impact it could have. These are some techniques that I can bring in that's going to accept that I'm stressed, but can maybe lower the temperature a little bit in situations where stress is not going to be helpful. And then can we take those ideas and then also think about how do we train for situations where we might be angry? How do we train for situations where we might be happy, that I might come into work, I'm happy, it's good, but just be okay. You know what? You're in a very good mood. Be careful about, that you might decrease risk, right? So I do this myself in the summer when it's camping season. I'm going on a camping trip that I do with my family every year. I know that when I'm driving, I'm just very happy. But sometimes I have to tell myself, okay, it's good to be happy, but pay extra attention when you're coming to intersections and things like that, because you're going to be less alert for cars that might run stop signs or things like that, right? So it's about kind of saying, okay, I know that this emotional state is leading me towards this. How do I then address my world as I'm approaching it? And so with this, I hope I've convinced you of why it's important to pay attention to emotions and affect, is that they are omnipresent, just like the weather. In and themselves, they're not good or bad. They actually depend on the context. But if we really want to understand mechanisms of daily life, and for example, in our world, things that are going to affect learning or being able to offer patient care or how our systems work, it's going to be important to then add to what we know of when do different affective patterns happen? What are the mechanisms? And how does what we perceive, what we remember, problems that we solve, how are they going to work differently under different affective conditions? And if hopefully I've convinced you that this is something that is appealing, this is some of the work that's been done. The first one is just a general book that is a review on emotions and cognition. It's a pretty good introduction to it. It's very well written and user friendly. And then the rest are papers that have taken a lot of that literature and we've applied it to try and understand how emotions impact a lot about in education, but it could have some links with patient care and patient safety. And with that, I do want to thank you for your attention. I will send a PDF of my slides to Will so that he can share it with the group. But if you have any questions that we don't address today, I am always happy to have emails from individuals. And so with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hopefully we can have a discussion of questions, clarifications, or even a bit of debate. I'm always open to a little bit of debate. So thank you for your attention to date.
Oh, thank you so much, Vicky, and a big round of applause from all of us here. That was a fascinating presentation. Thank you. And we do have some great questions in the chat, so I'm going to start by pulling out one or two of those, if that's okay. So we'll start with Lebaina's question, which was really about, I guess, how you've talked about training as one mechanism for addressing and helping us to recognize the impact of our emotions on how we make decisions, how we work. Lebain is talking there about kind of organizational structures and responses that were put in place, particularly during COVID-19 in the UK, where there's a great recognition that staff needed some space to decompress, to deal with those emotions and so on and so forth. And we had wobble rooms and other such things. And she's really interested to know about the sense that might have died down a bit, although it's not, those emotions haven't disappeared. Those interventions perhaps have just become less prominent now. Have you seen that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that if there's one silver lining to the pandemic in healthcare, is that it created conditions where it became more acceptable to talk about emotions, to recognize that emotions were happening. I think we started having a lot more candid conversations around that. And I know that in terms of the work that I've done, I saw a kind of greater acceptance or kind of legitimization of it. And and I do agree that it seems like the pendulum is swinging in the other direction. And I don't think it's malintentioned. I think it has to do with the fact of we had all of these conversations, we're able to have these conversations, but as societies, we almost ended up where we were maybe in limbo or perhaps wallowing, right? Waiting for the world to go back, being able to focus on the negative. And there's a general sense that if we spent so much time focusing on the negative, are we getting a little bit stuck in the mud? And so we're seeing a little bit of counter saying, well, maybe we need to pull up our socks and maybe we need to kind of start taking on the world. And my concern is that it might swing in the other direction of saying, okay, it's time to stop wallowing. It's time to stop having these emotions and trying to get to work. And what I'm hoping that we can do is find the happy medium of saying, these emotions are legitimate. These emotions are going to be affecting what it is that we want to do. And so we have to recognize them, we have to normalize them. But rather than saying, okay, it's time to get over it, let's go forward, which is a bit of a suppression avoidant type of way, is to sit there and say, okay, these emotions are legitimate. How can we recognize, acknowledge these emotional states and how they might have impact? And what are adaptive ways that we can kind of go forward, right? And so there's a little bit of the saying of, feel the fear and do it anyway, has some truth, but how do we do it anyway in ways that are going to be adaptive both for mental health but also adaptive for the problems that we want to do? And so I'm hoping, and I'm trying to encourage us to have a little bit more of those complex conversations of, let's not walk away from the conversations that we've had around emotions, but let's think about, okay, sometimes emotions are adaptive, sometimes they're maladaptive. When they're maladaptive, what are ways that we can either individually, interpersonally, or culturally regulate and manage these emotions in ways that are going to be adaptive for the individual, but also for the problem at hand, is kind of like my plea and my hope if we accomplish it.
That's a really great answer, Vicky. Thank you. Mark, there's a couple of questions there from you, so I'm going to hand over to you if that's okay to summarize those questions for Vicky.
Oh, great questions.
I can't hear you, Mark. Sorry, I don't know if there's something wrong with your. Are you still on mute?
I can.
Oh, there we are.
Yep.
Yeah.
So really interesting presentation. And just all the time I was just thinking about cognitive load. We've been doing some work around cognitive load and decision making.
Yeah.
And there's clearly a great bit of overlap here. So the question really was around, how much in effect is almost stress a proxy for cognitive load, cognitive overload? How much in effect could the stress just be down to this cognitive overload, or and the other way as well, that the cognitive load is causing the stress as well?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, and I have a lot of these conversations with my colleagues that do look at cognitive load. I would say that they're two separate but highly related concepts, right? Because the appraisal process for stress is when I'm faced with something that could potentially threaten an important goal, I do a very quick two-step appraisal of what are the demands being placed on me and what resources do I have to bring to bear. If I have the resources to meet the demands, or if I think I have the resources to meet the demands, I'm going to be what we call eustress or activated or challenged. And it's when I have that sense of, I don't have the resources to meet these demands, that you switch into distress. We see qualitative change in physiology that changes the way we process. And so cognitive load can be a source of demand that we don't have the resources for. So cognitive load can be a trigger. But the stress response is not just that the emotions are creating too much cognitive load. It's that we actually it's not that there's so much that we're dealing with that we have fewer resources to process with the rest, is that our cognitive processes qualitatively change as well. And so the quick answer would be cognitive load can be a source of stress. Emotions, especially when it's emotions that lead to rumination and kind of dwelling on the emotions, can be a source of cognitive load. But you can have stress in the absence of cognitive load, and you can have cognitive load in the absence of stress. And the stress response is not just a depletion of your resources, is that the brain actually functions differently. So a lot of really kind of close interactions there, but not always the same phenomenon, but kind of two very often co-occurring phenomenon, I would say. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, brilliant. And then the other question was just, we spent some time working with the aircraft industry, trying to understand how they use simulation and vice versa as well. And I'm aware that they do this upset training, which is often around a distraction, meaning that you miss a critical task or event. But I was just thinking, there is no reason why that couldn't be, an emotion, a negative or positive emotional input, rather than just another, one of their tasks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the aviation industry spends a lot of time thinking about this. The military spends a lot of time thinking about this. Not always in adaptive ways, because sometimes we see that there can be long-term sequelae, right? But this kind of thing where we use simulation to kind of create challenges for the learners, right? Upsets, things that could create emotions, and see how they deal with it. What I would say is if we do that, we should make sure that we actually include instruction or training or practice or guidance around adaptive ways to cope with the emotions in that situation, not just let's just throw them in the deep end and they sink or swim, which tends to be a bit of the or at least in the past, the military approach of either you can cut it or you don't cut it. Say, okay, look, you've been in the situation, there's these strong emotions, right? And so a colleague of mine in Queensland, Australia, Victoria Brazil, that's what they do. They do simulations once a week with the emergency medicine department, and people show up and they'll have about 15, 20 people that show up. They put them through scenarios. And they'll talk about a bit the medical and the teamwork, but they'll also talk about the stress and the emotions that are triggered by this and how the team can work together to recognize each other's emotions and regulate the emotions when they're not going to be adaptive, right? And so her work is specifically around stress exposure and developing adaptive ways that the team can support them. And it does two things. It normalizes these reactions, but it means that the team kind of look out for each other a little bit more. Is like, rather than saying like, oh, you're stressed, you're not going to be a useful member of the team. It's okay, you're stressed. How can I support you so that as a team we can function? And so I think simulation is a great environment that we can do that, so long as we do it in a way that is psychologically safe, and so long as we do it in a way where we proactively help them develop the skills that are going to be needed, and it's not just throw them in the churning ocean, and those that kind of survive then go on to be in these high risk professions.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, that has brought us precisely to the end of this hour of the seminar, and we do like to, I know there are other questions, and you've already said, Vicky, that you'd be happy if people do have a question they want to ask you to contact you via email. So I think without further ado, I should just say thank you to everybody for attending today, and thank you again, Vicky, for coming and presenting your fantastic ideas and the research that you've done in this area. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just quickly, a 30-second answer. Could emotion regulation training be an adaptive thing? Absolutely. I think we could use simulation, not just for teaching skills and for teaching teamwork and things like that. We could use simulation to trigger emotions and then teach emotion regulation strategies with that. I think we would do a lot of benefit to our healthcare workers and our learners if we did that.
Brilliant. Thanks for squeezing in that final answer. Much appreciated. And hopefully we'll speak to you again in the future. Cheers.
Thank you so much,
Bye,
everyone.
Vicky.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.